My name is Regina Hawthorne, and I once believed I could organize my life into neat, cataloged drawers, much like the antiques I sell. What a naive thought that was. I've been married to Louis for 10 years. A decade spent navigating the complexities of step-family dynamics with his son, Adrian. At first, Adrian was a quiet, polite young man who treated me with a respectful distance. That distance, however, would narrow with time, eventually leaving us standing too close for comfort. It happened on a quiet summer afternoon. We were at a riverside park, a last-minute escape from the heat of the city. It was one of those settings that invites vulnerability. The shimmering water, the cicadas humming in the trees. Adrian had been venting about his struggles with writing, and I, perhaps too candidly, shared my frustrations with feeling invisible in my marriage. A shared moment of honesty became something else entirely. A kiss that neither of us saw coming, nor stopped. From that single act, a web of consequences began to weave itself into every corner of my life. Adrian, once a brooding presence in the house, became a constant thought in my mind. Louis, preoccupied with his architectural firm, started noticing my restlessness. And Margot, my best friend and business partner, began asking questions I didn't want to answer. What started as a lapse in judgment grew into a secret too heavy to bear. The moment the truth came to light, it was like shattering porcelain, beautiful, brittle, and irreversible. And yet, the kiss was only the beginning. If I had known what was coming, I might never have gone to that park. But life doesn't offer such foresight, does it? I've always been fascinated by the way antiques hold on to stories. Every scratch on a mahogany table or tarnished hinge on a brass mirror speaks of hands that have touched it, lives that have surrounded it. The weight of history comforts me. It's ironic, then, that my own story, a life I thought was neatly curated, spiraled so chaotically. My name is Regina Hawthorne, and for the past 10 years I've lived what most would call a good life. My antique shop, Eternal Echoes, has flourished, and my marriage to Louis, an accomplished architect, has offered stability, if not passion. I've grown used to a life of order, where every piece, whether furniture or feelings, has its proper place. Or so I thought. Adrian Hawthorne, my stepson, entered my life when he was 16. Louis had been married before, to a woman whose absence filled every corner of the house when Adrian visited. At first, I was just Dad's new wife, a polite but distant figure in Adrian's life. Over the years, our interactions were minimal. Dinners when Louis insisted, passing conversations about school, and later, his struggle to establish himself as a writer. But something shifted recently, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when. Adrian had begun spending more time at the shop. At first, it seemed innocent. He was curious about the antiques, or so he claimed. His questions were thoughtful, probing, as though he were searching for something deeper. "How do you know when something's real?" he asked one rainy afternoon, his voice low but insistent. He was holding a silver pocket watch, its face scratched but still gleaming. "You learn to see the details," I replied, keeping my tone light. "The weight, the craftsmanship. Sometimes it's the imperfections that tell the story." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the watch before turning to me. "And what about people? Do the imperfections make them more authentic?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed, though it sounded forced. "I suppose they do. But people aren't antiques, Adrian." He smiled faintly, his eyes holding mine for a beat too long. "No, they're not." That interaction stayed with me, though I tried to dismiss it as overthinking. After all, Adrian was an adult now, a young man trying to find his place in the world. It wasn't unusual for him to seek deeper conversations, was it? But there were other moments, harder to ignore. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, the questions that felt more personal than casual. And then there was the day he arrived at the shop unannounced, a nervous energy about him. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the counter, "about what you said, how imperfections tell a story." I looked up from the ledger I was balancing. "Oh, have you found some imperfections to admire?" His smile was slow, almost deliberate. "Maybe. But sometimes, I think people try too hard to hide them, like they're afraid of being seen for who they really are." There it was again, that strange undercurrent in his words. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "Sometimes it's easier to hide," I said finally. He tilted his head, studying me. "Is that what you do?" The question felt too pointed, too intimate. I stood, busying myself with rearranging a shelf of porcelain figurines. Everyone does to some degree. Louis, of course, noticed none of this. He was consumed by his latest project, a sprawling, eco-friendly resort that demanded long hours and frequent travel. I told myself that was why I felt so restless lately. Why Adrian's visits seemed to punctuate my days with an intensity I couldn't quite understand. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Louis brought up Adrian. "He's been coming around a lot more lately," he said, flipping through blueprints spread across the coffee table. "Has he said anything about why?" "Not really," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "I think he just enjoys the change of pace. Writing can be isolating." Louis nodded, his attention already back on his work. "Good, it's nice to see him finding his footing." I forced a smile, though the knot in my stomach tightened. The next time Adrian came to the shop, he brought coffee. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, as though he were trying to carve out a space for himself in my world. "You didn't have to do that," I said as he handed me the cup. "Consider it a thank you," he replied, his smile disarming, "for putting up with all my questions." I took a sip, the warmth of the coffee grounding me. "I don't mind. It's nice to have someone take an interest." He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Do you ever get lonely here?" "In the shop, I mean." The question was unexpected, and I hesitated before answering. "Sometimes. But I've gotten used to it." His gaze didn't waver. "I don't think anyone should have to get used to being lonely." The first time I realized something had changed irrevocably between us was on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The shop was empty, save for the two of us, and the air felt heavy with unspoken words. "I've been thinking about what you said," Adrian began, his tone hesitant. I glanced up from the register. "What did I say?" "About hiding," he said, stepping closer. "About how it's easier to pretend." My breath hitched, the space between us suddenly too small. "Adrian, I don't..." Whatever I was about to say was lost as he reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. "I see you, Regina," he said softly. "I see all of you." The Riverside Park was one of those places you forget exists until someone reminds you. Nestled at the edge of town, it was a tranquil expanse of greenery, winding paths, and the soft murmur of water. I hadn't been there in years, but when Adrian suggested it, something about his persistence made me agree. "You need a break," he had said that morning, his tone light but insistent. "Let me take you somewhere." At first I resisted. The shop was busy, and Louis was out of town, another conference, another set of blueprints. But Adrian's expression was hard to refuse. There was a sincerity in his request that felt oddly comforting. The drive was quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel awkward but charged like a string pulled taut. Adrian seemed unusually thoughtful, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a kind of focus that made me wonder what was on his mind. "Why this park?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. He shrugged, his eyes on the road. "It's peaceful. I come here to clear my head sometimes." That surprised me. I hadn't thought of Adrian as someone who sought out quiet places. His world, as far as I knew, was filled with late nights, half-finished manuscripts, and the hum of city life. The park was nearly empty when we arrived. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the path. A faint breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the sound of the river rushing over smooth stones created a soothing rhythm. We walked in silence for a while, the only sounds our footsteps crunching on the gravel and the occasional chirp of a bird overhead. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, though the quiet also left space for thoughts I wasn't ready to face. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Adrian asked suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. I glanced at him, startled. "What do you mean?" He kicked at a loose stone on the path, his gaze fixed ahead. "Like, if things had gone differently, if you'd made different choices." It was an odd question, and I hesitated before answering. "I think everyone wonders that sometimes, but life doesn't give us do-overs." He nodded, his expression contemplative. "Do you regret anything?" The question felt too personal, too pointed. "Regret is a waste of time," I said, my tone firmer than I intended. "It doesn't change anything." Adrian stopped walking, turning to face me. "That's not really an answer," Something in his gaze made me uneasy. There was a vulnerability there, but also an intensity that I couldn't quite place. "What about you?" I asked, deflecting. "Do you have regrets?" His smile was faint, almost bitter. "More than I can count." We continued walking, the conversation shifting to safer topics. His writing, the challenges of finishing a novel, the frustrations of rejection letters. But even as we talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken lingered between us. We reached a clearing near the riverbank, where a wooden bench overlooked the water. Adrian gestured for me to sit, and I did, grateful for the chance to rest. He stood nearby, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the rushing water. "Do you ever feel like you're not really living your own life?" he asked, his tone quieter now. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Like, you're going through the motions," he said, turning to face me. "Doing what's expected of you, but it's not really you." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Because the truth was, I did feel that way. Often. But admitting it felt dangerous, like opening a door I wasn't sure I could close. Adrian stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Regina, The sound of my name on his lips sent a jolt through me. There was something raw in his voice, something that made my breath catch. "Adrian, don't." But he did. He leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both tentative and insistent. For a moment I froze, my mind racing with all the reasons why this was wrong. But then something in me broke, and I found myself kissing him back. The kiss didn't last long, just a few seconds, really. But it was enough to shatter the fragile equilibrium I'd been clinging to. I pulled back abruptly, my heart pounding. "We can't," I whispered, my voice shaky. Adrian's expression was conflicted, a mix of longing and regret. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't," I said, cutting him off. "Just don't." We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the river filling the space between us. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, couldn't trust myself to say anything else. Finally, Adrian spoke, his voice low. "It won't happen again. I promise." But the damage was already done. The drive home was quiet, the tension between us almost unbearable. I kept my gaze fixed on the road ahead, my hands gripping the edge of my seat as though it were the only thing keeping me grounded. When we pulled into the driveway, Adrian hesitated before turning off the engine. "Regina?" "Don't," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "Just go inside." He nodded, his shoulders slumping as he opened the door and stepped out. I stayed in the car for a moment, my mind racing. By the time I walked through the front door, Adrian had disappeared into his room. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat at the counter, staring at the darkened window. What had I done? Secrets are like antiques. They age, they tarnish, and eventually they crack under the pressure of time and neglect. But unlike antiques, they don't become more valuable. They become liabilities. I learned this the hard way in the weeks that followed that fateful afternoon at the park. Adrian kept his promise, at least on the surface. He didn't push, didn't bring up what had happened. If anything, he became quieter, more reserved, and yet his presence was inescapable. Every glance, every accidental touch, every word exchanged in passing carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. I tried to act normal, but the effort was exhausting. Louis returned from his trip a few days later, oblivious to the turmoil that had taken root in our household. He greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek and a rundown of his meetings, his mind already preoccupied with work. "How was everything while I was gone?" he asked over dinner that evening, his tone casual. "Uneventful," I replied, keeping my focus on my plate. "Adrian seemed to be in a good mood today," he said, glancing at his son. "Did something happen?" Adrian shrugged, not looking up. "Just got some writing done. That's all." Louis nodded, satisfied with the answer, but I could feel Adrian's gaze flicker toward me for the briefest moment. I kept my head down, my pulse quickening. The shop, once my sanctuary, became a place of suffocating tension. Adrian continued to visit, though less frequently than before. When he did, our conversations were stilted, filled with awkward silences and half-finished sentences. "Have you thought about expanding the shop?" he asked one afternoon, his tone light but his posture tense. "Expanding?" I repeated, caught off guard. He nodded, leaning against the counter. "You've got a good thing going here. You could open another location, maybe in the city." The idea was intriguing, but I couldn't focus on it. Not with Adrian standing so close, his presence making it impossible to think clearly. "I'll consider it," I said finally, avoiding his gaze. He hesitated as if waiting for me to say more, but when I didn't, he sighed and straightened. "I'll let you get back to work." As he turned to leave, I felt a pang of guilt that I couldn't explain. Margot, my business partner and closest friend, was the first to notice that something was off. "You've been distracted lately," she said one evening as we closed up the shop. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I replied too quickly. Margot raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Regina, I've known you for years. You're a terrible liar." I hesitated, debating whether to confide in her. Margot was sharp, perceptive, and fiercely loyal, but this wasn't the kind of secret you could share over coffee and laughs. "It's just family stuff," I said finally, hoping she wouldn't press further. "Family stuff," she repeated, her tone dubious. "Like what?" I busied myself with organizing a stack of invoices. "Adrian's been around more lately. It's been a little overwhelming." Margot's expression softened. "He's a good kid, but I get it. Sometimes family can be complicated." Her words felt like an understatement, but I nodded anyway. "Exactly." As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Adrian and me ebbed and flowed like a tide, never fully receding. There were moments when I thought I could ignore it, bury it beneath the routine of daily life. But then there were moments when the weight of it threatened to crush me. One evening, as I sat in the living room with a glass of wine, Adrian walked in, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, my heart pounding. "About what?" He glanced toward the hallway, where Louis's office door was closed. "Not here." The implication was clear, and it terrified me. But against my better judgment, I followed him to the backyard, where the evening air was cool and filled with the sound of crickets. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice raw. "Doing what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "Pretending like nothing happened, pretending like I don't feel." "Stop," I said quickly, cutting him off. "We can't talk about this." "Why not?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Because it's wrong? Because it's messy?" "I don't care, Regina. Don't," I said sharply, my voice trembling. "You don't know what you're saying." He stepped closer, his expression desperate. "Yes, I do, and you do too." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words, his presence was suffocating. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. "This has to stop," I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. Adrian's shoulders slumped, and he nodded, though his eyes were filled with a sadness that cut deeper than I expected. "If that's what you want." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and confusion. Adrian kept his distance, his absence both a relief and a source of pain I couldn't understand. Louis, meanwhile, grew more attentive, as if sensing that something was amiss. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. He frowned, his concern genuine. "If something's wrong, you can tell me." I nodded, though the words I wanted to say lodged in my throat. It wasn't until Margot confronted me directly that I realized how transparent I had become. "You're not yourself," she said one afternoon as we sorted through a shipment of vintage jewelry. "And don't tell me it's just family stuff." I froze, my hands trembling as I held a delicate gold necklace. "Margot, Regina," she interrupted, her voice firm. "Whatever's going on, you need to figure it out. Secrets have a way of destroying everything." Her words hit harder than I expected, and for a moment, I couldn't meet her gaze. "I know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Margot didn't press further, but her expression made it clear that she wouldn't let this go. The weight of the secret grew heavier with each passing day, and I began to wonder how long I could carry it before it crushed me entirely. Suspicion, once planted, grows like an invasive weed, creeping into the cracks of relationships and choking out trust. It starts subtly, an offhand comment, a glance that lingers too long, and before you realize it, it's taken root. Louis wasn't a man prone to jealousy or paranoia. His work consumed most of his energy, leaving little room for anything else. But even he couldn't ignore the shifting dynamics in our house. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening over dinner. I forced a smile, stirring my soup with more vigor than necessary. "Just tired, the shop's been busy." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me, searching for something beneath the surface. And Adrian? Has he been helping out much? I froze for the briefest moment, the question catching me off guard. Here and there, he's been focused on his writing. Louis leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He seems different, happier maybe? Have you noticed? Not particularly, I lied, keeping my gaze fixed on my plate. His silence was more telling than any accusation. Adrian, for his part, had grown more withdrawn. He still came to the shop occasionally, but our conversations were brief, guarded. The air between us crackled with unspoken words, each encounter leaving me more unsteady. One afternoon, as I was rearranging a display, Margot walked in, her expression unusually serious. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I glanced around, noting the absence of customers. "What's going on?" She closed the door behind her, lowering her voice. "It's about Adrian." My stomach dropped. "What about him?" Margot hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know what's going on, but something's not right. I've seen the way he looks at you." The words hit like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "You're imagining things," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Am I?" she pressed, crossing her arms. "Regina, I'm not blind, and if I can see it, so can Louis." The mention of Louis sent a fresh wave of panic through me. "There's nothing to see," I said firmly, though the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Margot sighed, her expression softening. "I'm your friend, Regina. I just don't want to see you get hurt." Her words lingered long after she left, a constant echo in the back of my mind. Louis's suspicions became harder to ignore as the days went on. He began asking more questions, his tone casual but probing. "Have you and Adrian been spending more time together?" he asked one evening, as we cleaned up after dinner. "Not really," I said, keeping my voice even. "Why?" he shrugged, his gaze steady. "Just curious. He seems more comfortable around you lately." I forced a laugh, hoping to deflect. "Well, I'd hoped so after all these years." Louis didn't smile. The breaking point came during a family dinner. Louis had insisted on a rare evening at home, a chance for the three of us to reconnect. The atmosphere was tense from the start, the silence between courses punctuated by the clinking of silverware. "So, Adrian," Louis said, his tone deceptively light, "what have you been working on lately?" Adrian glanced up, his expression guarded. "Just a few short stories." "Anything about family dynamics?" Louis asked, his gaze flickering toward me. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Adrian's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might explode. "No," he said finally, his voice cold. "Nothing like that." The rest of the meal passed in strained silence, the unspoken tension suffocating. That night, as I lay in bed beside Louis, I could feel the weight of his suspicion pressing down on me. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible in the dark. My heart raced, panic clawing at my chest. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, his expression shadowed. "You've been distant. And Adrian? He's not acting like himself. I can't help but wonder if there's a reason." I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to my ears. "You're overthinking things." "Am I?" he asked, his voice sharper now. I rolled over, feigning sleep to avoid further questions. But I knew this was only the beginning. The following day, Louis came to the shop unannounced. I was in the back room when I heard the door chime, followed by his voice. "Regina?" I stepped out, my pulse quickening. "What are you doing here?" "I thought I'd surprise you," he said, his tone casual. But his eyes were scanning the room, searching for something, or someone. "Just working," I said, forcing a smile. "Did you need something?" Before he could answer, the door chimed again, and Adrian walked in, his expression freezing when he saw Louis. "Adrian," Louis said, his voice tight. "I didn't know you'd be here." Adrian shrugged, avoiding his father's gaze. "Just stopping by." The tension in the room was unbearable, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air like a storm about to break. "Regina," Louis said finally, his tone deceptively calm. "Why don't you tell me what's really going on?" The confrontation that followed was inevitable. Louis's voice rose with each accusation, his anger spilling over like a dam that had finally burst. "You think I haven't noticed?" he demanded, his gaze darting between Adrian and me. "The looks, the whispers, do you take me for a fool?" "Louis, stop," I pleaded, my voice shaking. Adrian stepped forward, his expression defiant. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Louis shouted, his face red with fury. I couldn't answer. The words caught in my throat, the truth too devastating to admit. Enough, Louis said finally, his voice low and cold. Both of you, out of my house. Adrian and I left that night, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a suffocating blanket. Secrets have a way of destroying not just the people who keep them, but also everyone in their orbit. That night, as Adrian and I drove away from the house, the weight of what we'd done and what we'd lost settled in the air between us, thick and suffocating. He drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I stared out the window, watching the darkened streets blur past, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Where were we going? What was I going to do? We can't go back, Adrian said finally, breaking the silence. I turned to him, his words sinking like a stone in my chest. What do you mean? His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the road. You heard him. He doesn't want us there. It's his house, I whispered, the truth of it cutting deeper than I expected. Adrian's hands gripped the wheel tighter. It's your life too, Regina. He doesn't get to take that away from you. I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know what was left of my life to claim. We ended up at a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and peeling wallpaper. It was all we could afford, and even that felt like too much. Adrian paid for the room, his movements stiff and mechanical, as though the act of doing something normal could anchor him in the chaos. Inside, the room was small and claustrophobic, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the air. I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands, while Adrian paced the room, his energy restless and frantic. What happens now? He asked, his voice tight. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped pacing, turning to face me. We can't just stay here. We have to figure something out. I looked up at him, my exhaustion warring with the guilt that had been gnawing at me since the moment this all began. Adrian, this isn't sustainable. We can't keep running from this. What else are we supposed to do? He demanded, his voice rising. Go back? Pretend like everything's fine? You saw the way he looked at us, Regina. There's no going back from that. His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The days that followed were a blur of aimless planning and restless tension. Adrian spent hours on his laptop, searching for jobs, apartments, anything that might give us a semblance of stability. I, meanwhile, felt like a ghost of myself, drifting through the motions of daily life without purpose or direction. Margot called once, her voice filled with concern. Where are you? She asked, her tone frantic. Louis has been calling everyone, trying to figure out where you've gone. I hesitated, my mind racing for an answer that wouldn't incriminate either of us. I needed some time to think, I said finally. Regina, this isn't like you, she said, her voice softening. Whatever's going on, you need to tell me. I can help. But she couldn't. No one could. The turning point came one evening when Adrian returned from a grocery run, his expression grim. There was a reporter outside, he said, his voice low. I froze, the implications of his words sinking in. What do you mean? He set the bags down, his movements slow and deliberate. Someone's talking, Regina. I don't know if it's Dad or Margot, but someone knows. My heart raced, panic clawing at my chest. What did they ask you? Nothing, he said quickly. I didn't stop. But if they're digging, it's only a matter of time before they find us. The reality of our situation hit me like a freight train. We were fugitives, not from the law, but from the lives we'd built, the people we'd hurt. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Adrian on the phone, his voice low and urgent. I'm telling you, it's not what you think, he said, his tone defensive. We just needed some space. I sat up, my heart sinking as I realized who he was talking to. Adrian, I said, my voice sharp. He glanced at me, his expression conflicted. It's Margot. I reached for the phone, my hand trembling. Margot, I can explain. Don't bother, she said, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Louis told me everything. My blood ran cold. Everything? She sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment. Regina, what were you thinking? Do you have any idea what you've done? I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, my voice breaking. I didn't. You didn't mean to? She interrupted, her voice rising. Then what did you mean, Regina? Because from where I'm standing it looks like you've destroyed everything for nothing. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. The fallout came swiftly after that. Margot, whether out of anger or misplaced loyalty, told Louis where we were. He showed up at the motel a few days later, his expression a mix of fury and devastation. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Louis, please," I began, but he cut me off. "Now, Regina." Adrian stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "She's not going anywhere with you." Louis's gaze snapped to him, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Stay out of this, Adrian. This doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't," Adrian shot back. The confrontation escalated quickly, their voices rising until the motel manager threatened to call the police. In the end, I left with Louis, if only to defuse the situation. The car ride home was silent, the air between us thick with tension. When we arrived, Louis turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I want the truth," he said finally. And so I told him. The truth, once spoken, has a way of unraveling everything. My marriage to Louis ended in the weeks that followed, our lives splitting apart like a fractured mirror. Adrian disappeared shortly after, leaving behind only a brief note. "I'm sorry." I returned to the shop, to the only semblance of normalcy I had left, though even that felt hollow. Margot eventually forgave me, though our friendship was never quite the same. As for me, I'm still trying to piece together what's left of my life. But some things, once broken, can never truly be repaired. The champagne flute felt cool in my hand as I stood in the corner of the dimly lit lounge. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air around me. But my mind was elsewhere. It was my birthday, and my coworkers had insisted on throwing me a party. I had protested, of course, claiming I didn't need the fuss, but they didn't listen. So here I was, surrounded by balloons and well wishes, trying to enjoy myself but feeling oddly detached. And then I saw him. Julian. He stood across the room, holding court like only he could. Even at 62, he had a presence that commanded attention. The way he moved, the way he spoke, he was magnetic. I had always admired him from a distance. Julian, the seasoned stage actor turned voice talent, had been working with my team for a few months now, lending his voice and gravitas to one of our most ambitious gaming projects. He was charming, professional, and just aloof enough to be fascinating. But tonight, there was something different about the way he looked at me. I was mid-conversation with a colleague when Julian appeared at my side. "Margot," he said smoothly, his deep voice cutting through the noise, "may I steal you for a moment?" My coworker stepped aside, and before I could process what was happening, Julian was leading me toward a quieter corner of the room. He handed me a fresh glass of champagne, his fingers brushing mine as he did. "Happy birthday," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "Thank you," I replied, my voice coming out softer than I intended. He raised his glass, his gaze locking with mine. "To you," he said, "and to all the things you deserve but don't allow yourself to have." His words took me by surprise, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. The way he looked at me, intense, knowing, sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could say anything, he reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was subtle, almost innocent, but it lingered. "Enjoy your night, Margot," he said, his voice low and warm. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. But the feeling he left behind stayed with me, buzzing like static electricity in the air. After the party, I couldn't stop thinking about Julian. It wasn't just the way he spoke to me or the lingering touch that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the way he made me feel. Seen. Not as a senior director, not as someone's mother, and not as a woman edging into her late 50s. He looked at me like I was something else. That night, as I slipped off my heels and peeled away the dress that had started to feel too tight after hours of smiling and making small talk, I caught myself in the mirror. It was the same face I saw every day, laugh lines, faint crow's feet, and a touch of gray at my temples. I tried to remember the last time someone looked at me the way Julian had. I couldn't. I first met Julian 6 months ago. He came onto the project as a voice actor for one of our most ambitious gaming narratives, a dark, brooding anti-hero with layers of pain and charisma that only Julian could embody. His stage presence was legendary, though he had stepped back from live theater years ago. He was polite but distant at first, a consummate professional. He addressed everyone with the same warmth and respect, yet never let anyone get too close. I admired him for it. His ability to stay both approachable and untouchable. Working with him was seamless. He'd stride into the recording booth, headphones in place, and deliver his lines with the kind of gravitas that silenced the entire room. It was hard not to be drawn to him, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. Half the team seemed to have some level of fascination with Julian. But for me, it was different. I told myself it was purely professional, an admiration for his craft. And yet there were moments when I'd catch myself watching him a little too long, or feeling the brush of his hand during a handshake a little too keenly. It was harmless, I told myself. Until my birthday. The Monday after the party, Julian stopped by my office. I was reviewing scripts, my desk cluttered with notes and marked up pages, when I heard the familiar knock on the doorframe. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his voice smooth and warm. I looked up, startled but pleased to see him. "Not at all, come in." He stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room. He wore a fitted blazer over a black shirt, and for a moment I forgot what I was supposed to say. "I just wanted to say thank you," he began, leaning casually against the edge of my desk. "For the party. It was a lovely evening." I blinked. "Thank me? I didn't plan it." "No," he said, his lips quirking into a small smile. "But you were the reason for it, and I don't think I've had that much fun at a work event in years." I laughed softly, trying to ignore the flutter in my chest. "I'll pass that along to the team." He tilted his head, his gaze steady. "You're modest, Margot. You don't give yourself enough credit." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a faint blush rise to my cheeks. "Well, thank you, Julian. That's kind of you to say." He nodded, standing upright again. "I won't keep you, just wanted to stop by." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Oh, and Margot?" "Yes? Let me know if you'd like to grab dinner sometime. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some ideas for the script." My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone light. "Just let me know when." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a flicker of something dangerous through me. "I will." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in my office, my heart racing. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Julian. There was something about the way he spoke to me, the way he held gaze just a little too long, that unsettled me in the best way. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. He was just being polite, charming, the way he always was. But deep down, I knew better. That evening, as I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I saw Julian again. He was in the parking lot, leaning against his car, scrolling through his phone. When he looked up and saw me, his face lit up. "Margot," he called, slipping his phone into his pocket. I hesitated but walked over to him. "Still here?" "Wanted to catch you before you left," he said, his tone casual but his eyes intent. "About dinner. Are you free tomorrow night?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I knew this wasn't just about work, but the thought of spending an evening with him, just the two of us, was too tempting to resist. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm free." "Perfect," he said, smiling. "I'll text you the details." As I walked to my car, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. Something was happening between Julian and me, and I wasn't ready to stop it. The next evening, I stood in front of my mirror, second-guessing my outfit for the 5th time. I'd chosen a simple black dress, nothing too revealing, but flattering enough to feel confident. My hair was styled loosely, and I'd taken the time to apply a subtle touch of makeup. "It's just dinner," I told myself, but the way my heart was pounding said otherwise. Julian had texted earlier with the name of the restaurant, Vermilion. 7 p.m. "Can't wait to see you." The words lingered in my mind as I grabbed my coat and left the house. When I arrived, he was already waiting. The restaurant was intimate, the kind of place with low lighting and candlelit tables. Julian stood near the entrance, dressed in a navy blazer that made his silver hair seem even more striking. When he saw me, his face broke into a smile that made me feel warm all over. "Margot," he said, stepping forward to greet me. "You look stunning." "Thank you," I replied, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. "You don't look too bad yourself." He chuckled, his hand lightly touching my back as he guided me inside. The dinner began innocently enough. We talked about work, the progress on the game, and his experiences as a stage actor. He shared stories about his time in London, performing in packed theaters, and the way transitioning to voice acting had given him a new perspective on storytelling. "You must miss the stage," I said, taking a sip of my wine. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but there's something freeing about lending just your voice to a character. It lets the audience fill in the rest." His eyes met mine, and I felt the weight of his gaze. Besides, there are other ways to keep the passion alive. The conversation shifted then, subtly but unmistakably. By the time dessert arrived, the tension between us was palpable. Julian leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate tone. "You're remarkable, you know," he said, his eyes locked on mine. I let out a nervous laugh, unsure how to respond. "You're being too kind." "No," he said firmly. "I mean it. The way you carry yourself, the way you command a room without even trying, it's rare." His words made my heart race. No one had spoken to me like that in years, and it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "Julian," I began, but he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know." After dinner, he insisted on walking me to my car. The night air was cool, and the quiet hum of the city surrounded us as we made our way to the parking lot. "Thank you for tonight," I said when we reached my car. "It was lovely." "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his voice low. For a moment we stood there, the silence stretching between us. Then, before I could process what was happening, he stepped closer, his hand gently cupping my face. "Margot," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin, and then he kissed me. It was slow at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But when I didn't, the kiss deepened, his hand sliding to my waist as he pulled me closer. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping the fabric of his blazer, as the world around us seemed to fade away. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless. "I've wanted to do that since the party," he admitted, his forehead resting against mine. "Julian," I whispered, my mind racing. "This isn't." "Don't," he said gently, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "Don't tell me it's wrong, not tonight." I closed my eyes, torn between the logical part of me that knew this was a mistake and the part that craved the way he made me feel. Finally I nodded. "Not tonight." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken tension. At work, we kept things professional, but there were glances, fleeting touches, and conversations that lingered just a little too long. Every time I saw him, my heart raced, and I found myself looking forward to the next time we'd be alone. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, after a particularly long day of recording sessions, Julian knocked on my office door. "Come in," I called, expecting Ella, my assistant. When Julian stepped inside, my breath caught. He closed the door behind him, his expression serious but his eyes soft. "Are you free tonight?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, my mind immediately racing through all the reasons I should say no. But then I saw the way he was looking at me, like I was the only person in the world. "Yes," I said quietly. We ended up at his apartment that night. It was a modest space filled with books, framed posters from old plays, and a faint scent of cedarwood. "This is where you live?" I asked, looking around. He smiled, shrugging. "It's not much, but it's home." Before I could say anything else, he stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my hips. "I'm glad you came." "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The kiss that followed was slow and deliberate, his hands sliding up my back as he guided me toward the couch. Everything about him, his touch, his scent, the way he whispered my name, felt intoxicating. That night was unlike anything I'd experienced in years. Julian wasn't just attentive. He was present in a way that made me feel cherished, desired, and utterly alive. As we lay tangled together afterward, the city lights filtering through the curtains, he turned to me and said, "You deserve to feel like this every day." His words stayed with me long after I left his apartment, a quiet echo in the back of my mind. From that night on, everything changed. We began finding excuses to see each other. Dinners that turned into long, passionate evenings, late-night calls that ended with whispered confessions. The secrecy of it all only made it more thrilling, but it also made it dangerous. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep this part of my life separate from everything else. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before the lines blurred. After that night at Julian's apartment, there was no turning back. Our connection burned too brightly, and the pull between us was impossible to ignore. We became consumed by the thrill of stolen moments and the secrecy that surrounded our affair. It wasn't just the physical aspect, though that was intoxicating. It was the way he made me feel seen and alive in a way I hadn't been for years. The first time we crossed the line at work was after another late-night recording session. Everyone else had left for the day, and I was finishing up notes in my office when Julian knocked on the door. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the room in that way only he could. "You're still here," he said, closing the door behind him. "I could say the same about you," I replied, setting down my pen. He smiled, leaning against the edge of my desk. "I couldn't leave without seeing you." My breath hitched, and I tried to keep my composure. "Julian, we're at work." "I know," he said, his voice soft as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "But I can't help myself when it comes to you." The kiss that followed was slow, deliberate, and entirely reckless. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me closer as I melted into him. For a moment, the rest of the world faded away, and there was only Julian. His touch, his scent, the way he whispered my name like it was something sacred. After that, our affair became a delicate dance of risk and reward. We found ways to be together without raising suspicion, lunch breaks that turned into stolen kisses in the stairwell, late-night text exchanges that often ended with him at my door. Julian had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel electric. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen of his apartment, he turned to me with a bottle of wine in his hand and said, "You make the ordinary feel extraordinary, Margot." It was a simple statement, but it left me breathless. The secrecy of our relationship was both exhilarating and exhausting. At work, I was hyper-aware of every glance, every interaction, afraid that someone might notice the way Julian and I gravitated toward each other. My assistant, Ella, was the first to pick up on the subtle changes in my behavior. "You've been different lately," she said one morning as she handed me a stack of reports. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "I don't know," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Happier, maybe. More distracted." I laughed nervously, brushing off her observation. "Must be the birthday glow." Ella didn't look convinced, but she didn't push the subject. The first real crack in our carefully constructed facade came during a company retreat. It was a weekend getaway to a secluded resort, meant to foster team bonding and creativity. Julian and I knew it would be risky, spending so much time together in close quarters, but the thought of being away from each other for 2 days was unbearable. The first evening was uneventful. We mingled with coworkers, keeping a safe distance, but every glance we exchanged was charged with unspoken longing. Later that night, when the rest of the team had retired to their rooms, Julian slipped a note under my door. "Meet me in the garden. Midnight." My heart raced as I read the note, and I knew I should ignore it. But when the clock struck 12, I found myself walking through the quiet pathways of the resort's garden, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. When I found him, he was leaning against a stone bench, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight. "You came," he said, his voice low and warm. "I shouldn't have," I whispered, stepping closer. "But you did," he replied, reaching out to take my hand. The kiss we shared under the stars was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Slow, tender, and filled with a quiet desperation. It felt like the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of us in that moment. But the magic didn't last. The next morning, as I sat in the dining hall with my coworkers, I noticed Ella watching me. Her gaze flicked between me and Julian, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. She didn't say anything, but the knowing look on her face sent a chill down my spine. Later that day, she cornered me in the hallway. "Margot," she said, her tone carefully neutral, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What's going on with you and Julian?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't find my voice. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said finally, forcing a laugh. She raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to lie to me. I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him." I opened my mouth to respond, but she held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not judging you," she said softly. But be careful, Margot. People are starting to notice. Ella's warning stayed with me, but it wasn't enough to stop me from seeing Julian. If anything, it only made our time together feel more precious, like we were fighting against the clock. One evening, as we lay tangled together on his couch, Julian turned to me with a serious expression. "Margot," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity, "what are we doing?" I frowned, propping myself up on one elbow. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," he said, gesturing between us. "Sneaking around, hiding how we feel. Don't you want more?" His words sent a wave of panic through me. "Julian, you know this isn't simple." "It could be," he said, his hand brushing against my cheek, "if we stop caring about what other people think." I looked away, my chest tightening. "It's not that easy," he sighed, pulling me into his arms. "It could be," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. As much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of a cliff. Every kiss, every stolen moment, brought us closer to the inevitable fall. And deep down, I knew the fall was coming. I should have known it couldn't last. Secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully you try to keep them hidden. The unraveling began with an email. It arrived one rainy Thursday morning as I was settling into my office, sipping my coffee and preparing for a long day of meetings. The subject line was innocuous enough: HR concern, private and confidential. I opened it, expecting some routine inquiry about workplace compliance or a training session I'd forgotten to attend. Instead, my stomach dropped. "Margot, we have received a report regarding a potential conflict of interest and inappropriate conduct between you and one of our contracted talent members. Please meet with HR at 2 p.m. to discuss further." I stared at the screen, the words blurring before my eyes. My heart began to race, my thoughts spinning out of control. Who reported us? How much did they know? My hands shook as I reached for my phone, dialing Julian. He picked up on the first ring. "Margot," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "We have a problem," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. By the time 2 p.m. rolled around, my anxiety was at an all-time high. I walked into the HR office, doing my best to project an air of calm, even as my heart threatened to pound out of my chest. Victoria, the head of HR, sat across from me, her expression unreadable. Beside her was another member of the HR team, a younger woman with a laptop open in front of her. "Margot, thank you for coming in," Victoria began, her tone professional but firm. "We've received an anonymous tip alleging that you've been engaging in a personal relationship with Julian Caro, one of our contracted voice actors. Is there any truth to this claim?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but she held up a hand, stopping me. "Before you answer, I want to let you know that we've reviewed some evidence provided to us." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots of text messages between Julian and me, emails we'd exchanged about meeting up outside of work, and even a photo of the two of us walking together in the garden during the company retreat. The room seemed to close in around me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and completely powerless. "I'm not going to deny it," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I want to make it clear that it hasn't affected my work or the project." Victoria nodded, her expression remaining neutral. "Thank you for your honesty. However, this is a serious breach of our policies regarding workplace relationships, particularly when there is a potential imbalance of power." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over me. When I left the meeting, I went straight to Julian's apartment. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been waiting for me. "What happened?" he asked, pulling me inside. "They know," I said, my voice breaking. "Someone reported us. HR has everything: texts, emails, photos. They're launching a formal investigation." Julian's jaw tightened, his hand gripping mine. "Let me take the fall," he said firmly. "I'll tell them it was all me, that I pursued you." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I won't let you do that. You've worked too hard to build your reputation." "And you haven't?" he shot back. I sighed, leaning into him. "This is my mess to deal with. I'll take responsibility." The fallout was swift. By the end of the week, I was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Julian, being a contractor, wasn't subject to the same scrutiny, but the whispers and stares at work were enough to make him withdraw from the project entirely. Ella, my assistant, came to my office on my last day before leave, her expression a mix of sympathy and regret. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said quietly. I froze, realizing what she was admitting. "It was you," I said, my voice barely audible. "I didn't give them everything," she said quickly. "Just enough to raise a flag. I thought it would be a warning, not..." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "Why, Ella?" "I was trying to protect you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "You were taking risks, Margot. I didn't want to see you lose everything." Her words stung, but I couldn't find it in me to be angry. Deep down, I knew she wasn't wrong. The worst confrontation came at home. My son, Daniel, showed up unannounced one evening, his face filled with a mixture of concern and disappointment. "Mom," he said, closing the door behind him, "I've been hearing things about you and some actor you're working with." I felt my heart sink. "Daniel? Is it true?" he interrupted, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "What were you thinking? You've worked so hard to get where you are, and now you're risking everything for what?" "I didn't plan for this to happen," I said quietly. "It just did." "That's not good enough," he said, his voice cracking. "You're supposed to be the one who has it all together. You're supposed to be better than this." His words cut deep, and for the first time in years, I felt like a failure. Not just as a professional, but as a mother. By the time I returned to Julian's apartment that night, I was emotionally drained. He opened the door, pulling me into his arms without a word. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It's too much." He held me tightly, his own pain evident in the way he clung to me. "Margot, please, we can get through this. Together." I pulled back, looking into his eyes. "I love you, Julian, but I can't keep destroying everything around me for this." His expression crumbled, but he nodded. "If this is what you need." "It's not what I want," I said, my voice breaking. "But it's what I have to do." That was the last time I saw Julian. We parted on bittersweet terms, knowing that what we had was real but unsustainable. As I walked away from his apartment, I felt like a part of me was being left behind. And yet, I knew it was the only choice I could make. It's been 3 months since I ended things with Julian, and my life has been in a kind of suspended animation ever since. The HR investigation concluded with a voluntary resignation, on my part. It wasn't officially labeled as misconduct, but the whispers and judgment from my colleagues made it clear I could never return to that office again. I packed up my belongings and left Apex Interactive behind, the weight of my decisions following me like a shadow. I took a small freelance project to keep myself busy, but it's not the same. My days are quieter now, filled with long stretches of solitude, broken only by the occasional call from my son, Daniel, or an email from a former coworker asking for advice. Daniel and I have started to repair things, though it hasn't been easy. When he came to visit last weekend, I apologized again for disappointing him, but he shook his head and said, "I just want you to be happy, Mom. Whatever that means." His words stayed with me long after he left. As for Julian, he disappeared from my life as cleanly as if he had never been there at all. There were no calls, no texts, no emails. I think he knew that reaching out would only make things harder for both of us. But that didn't stop me from checking my phone more often than I'd care to admit, hoping for a message that never came. The silence was unbearable at first. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was thinking of me as much as I was thinking of him. But as the weeks turned into months, the ache dulled into something quieter, something I could live with. Yesterday I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, but I knew who it was from the moment I saw the handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and 2 tickets to a stage play Julian was starring in, a return to live theater after years away. The letter was short but heartfelt. "Margot, you were right to end things, but that doesn't mean I've stopped caring. You reminded me of who I used to be, and for that, I'll always be grateful. If you ever want to see the part of me that you helped bring back, the tickets are yours. No expectations, no strings, just gratitude. Julian." I stared at the letter for a long time, my emotions swirling. Last night, I went to the theater. I didn't tell anyone, didn't bring a guest. I just slipped into one of the back rows and waited for the lights to dim. When Julian stepped onto the stage, my breath caught. He looked as confident and commanding as ever, his voice carrying through the room with the kind of power that made every word feel like a revelation. For the next 2 hours, I let myself be transported by his performance, marveling at the man I had known so intimately, yet could never fully hold on to. When the play ended, the audience erupted into applause, and Julian took his bow. As he straightened, his eyes scanned the crowd, and for a brief moment, they landed on me. He didn't smile, didn't react, just held my gaze for a beat longer than necessary before turning away. It was enough. As I walked out of the theater that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. What Julian and I had was beautiful, messy, and fleeting, but it was exactly what I needed in that chapter of my life. He reminded me that I was still capable of passion, of taking risks, of feeling alive. And now, it was time to figure out what came next.